No. If I need the mic, you speak up and we'll get it, but I think my voice will carry well enough. If it doesn't, those of you in the back, raise your hand and say, get that microphone. Well, Colleen asked me to speak about corn, wheat, and beans. That's what I'm most used to speaking about. This is arranged a little bit differently than the others. We'll talk about corn first, and then wheat, and then beans. So I'm going to try to go through each section of it. There's a little bit more here on corn than there are the other two, so I hope anybody doesn't think we're sliding wheat and beans. I don't mean to. We start out every time and say feed the soil, let the soil feed the plant. Whether you're going corn, wheat, or beans, take care of that soil and it'll take care of your crop. Broadcast NPK and S and traces. If you have, our recommendation sheet has a thing at the bottom that says all recommendations are broadcasted unless otherwise specified. That's because if you broadcast all the nutrients, then you're feeding the whole soil. You're feeding all the biology of that soil. And if you start trying to put it right down beside the row, how long does it take before you get too much? Or what all are you starving that you're not really taking care of in the proper way? If we can get it done, and this is what Dr. Albrecht would always stress, take care of that soil and it'll take care of the plants. And the clients that we have tell us that, look, once we started taking care of the soil, it cost us less money to grow the most crop that we've ever grown. And I'm talking about people that started with us in the 1970s. And they say, when I talk to my neighbors, they always said, oh, I can't afford to do that. And they said, on the other hand, when you start doing it, you find out it costs the least amount of money per unit of production of anything that's done. And what we tell everybody is that when I make a presentation, I tell everybody, I'm not trying to convince you to do this on everything. Take a little bitty piece and find out if it works. And once you know it works, then you can start moving on further into it, because, look, if it's science, it works. And what we say is take a small enough area that you don't just do it 1 year, because there can be, things can happen in 1 year, but take that area and set it aside, do whatever's called for the first year, do whatever's called for the crop the second year, do whatever's called for the third year. Do it 3 years in a row and evaluate that compared to what you're doing. When you do it that way, that's how we try to get clients to do things. And this is what Dr. Albrecht used to always say. Once they find out how it works and then how economical it is, then they can decide to move into it at whatever pace. And most of the time, people tell us, I wish I'd done it all. But if you don't make it work right, if you misunderstand, and we go to a lot of farms and the guy thinks big farms, and the guys say, well, we think we did what you did, but did you mean this? Well, sometimes they didn't do it right. Make sure you learn the program and how it's going to work, and then expand from there. So it's not trying to talk you into doing everything at once. Nitrogen sources for corn. I understand that one of the concerns up here is, how do you keep nitrogen for corn? Well, down where we live, we get 40 to 45 inches of rainfall a year, and a lot of it comes in the springtime. And the rain crop that we have in that area is corn, and everybody faces the same thing. How do we keep from losing our nitrogen? When we start looking at nitrogen sources, there are quite a few here, but used to we had ammonium nitrate. We can still get ammonium nitrate if we order it up ahead of time. And I think when we lost ammonium nitrate, we lost one of the best nitrogen sources that we could have. But ammonium sulfate, a lot of people look at that and say, oh, that's too expensive. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Anhydrous ammonia, in our area, if it's sand and the guy has a choice, the guys on sand still use a lot of anhydrous. I don't know if you use anhydrous here or not, but I don't tell a farmer what he ought to use. They tell us, well, this is what we're going to use, and then we make the recommendations. But any farmer that tells me he's going to use anhydrous ammonia, we up the nitrogen by 20% that he's applying as anhydrous if we want to get the same yield as the other sources when we broadcast. By the time you do that, anhydrous ammonia is not cheap. Actually, we'll have clients that will switch from anhydrous ammonia, not because we're saying do it, because we don't tell them do it. They add up the economics and see what's there. Calcium nitrate, sodium nitrate, potassium nitrate, those are available but generally they cost enough or somewhat that most fertilizer companies don't handle them. Urea, and anhydrous ammonia used to be ammonium nitrate, were the three that were most utilized. The one that we try to get our farmers to utilize is ammonium sulfate. Now here's why. We use urea. If it's corn following wheat or wheat following corn, or we've got residues there to break down, ammonium sulfate doesn't do that fast enough. So if we need a push right in the spring, the first thing we're going to do is make sure we have enough nitrogen. Now used to we'd use ammonium nitrate, now we use urea. But we want something there to break down those residues so that we don't rob the nitrogen from that corn as it starts to grow off. Once we get enough to break down the residues, which is generally going to be 20 to 30 pounds of N, the old rule of thumb is this: it takes 1 pound of N to break down 100 pounds of corn stalks or 100 pounds of wheat stubble. So you estimate how much you got in the spring, put a pound of N per one, and some of that's going to break down over the winter, so generally we'll wind up 20, 25, 30 units of nitrogen from urea, or if a guy's got some ammonium nitrate, we'll use that. But then, the next thing we want to do is take a look, and now it depends on what your maturity of the corn is. Down in our area, it's generally 110, 112 day corn. 110 day corn, you need 65% of your nitrogen before tassel and 35% afterward. 90 day corn, you need 90% before tassel and 10% afterward. Same as you need for grain sorghum, same as you need for sweet corn or popcorn. 90% before tassel, 10% afterwards. So if you're raising a 90-day corn, you want something that breaks down really quick. And ammonium sulfate, from the time you put ammonium sulfate on, it's going to be about 60 warm days before you get the major push from ammonium sulfate. With urea or ammonium nitrate, it's going to be 30 warm days. So if we've got a 90-day corn, we need to make sure we're going to get that nitrogen on quick enough that we can push it. So the clients we have that are growing 110, 120 day corn, we'll tell them put ammonium sulfate on at planting time. And we've got clients that on thousands of acres will take a fertilizer buggy applicator on the day they're planting and go over the acres of corn and cotton and put ammonium sulfate on there, because they know if they start getting a bunch of rain, they can't get over those soils. As long as you put that ammonium sulfate there and the water doesn't stand over it for 4 days, as long as that nitrogen in the ammonia form, it can rain and rain and rain, and that nitrogen is not going anywhere. As long as it's in the ammonia form, it's staying there. And you can go and do a nitrate and ammonia analysis, pull it right up in the row where the corn is, and show you still got the nitrogen there. So that's one of the reasons we say use ammonium sulfate, because it just so happens on that corn and cotton that we're growing down there 60 days later when we need our major push. Now, the other thing that Dr. Albrecht would always point out, which I talked about in the last session, and that is, he said, if you put ammonia and nitrogen on a crop, as long as that crop's going slow, it can convert that ammonia to nitrate nitrogen and right inside the plant and get enough, as long as it's just going slow. But when you want that fast spurt of growth, it needs a lot of nitrate quick, and it can't convert that fast enough. That's when you need to have that nitrate push. So if it's grain sorghum, we want that push in 30 days. We don't put ammonium sulfate on there to get that push, because it's going to be too late unless we put it on 30 days ahead of time. Some people will do that, but if we're starting to look at sweet corn or popcorn or 90-day corn, then what we're going to look at is ammonium nitrate or urea. Put that on, because that's going to be the best push. Now, when you put that on there, you're running a chance, because that urea converts to nitrate rather quickly, and the ammonia nitrate's already nitrate, so at least the nitrate portion. So once it's converted to nitrate, you get a lot of rain, it's going to leach away. That's why we try to time the release in terms of in terms of corn, so that the ammonium sulfate, we get that on 60 days ahead of time, and urea or ammonium nitrate, we get on 30 days ahead of time. If you're using urea, when you put that on, either cover it or water it in. At least a ½ inch of water. If you get a ½ inch of rain, that's okay. If you get a ½ inch of irrigation water. But if you put urea on and leave it on top of the soil, the biology in that soil will start converting that urea to ammonia gas, and ammonia gas is going to go right into the air. And the manufacturers of urea, the biggest manufacturers in the U.S. used to be Tennessee Valley Authority, and even the guys that studied it, TVA, said, when you put urea on the soil, if you don't cover it or water it in, 3 days you'll lose 25% of that nitrogen, in 7 days you'll lose 50% of it. If you lose that, you better come back and make it up, because it's not, otherwise you're not going to get the response. I don't think I have to show you nitrogen deficiency in corn, but that's a typical beginning nitrogen deficiency in a corn leaf. Starts as a yellow V at the tip, and then eventually it'll turn yellow all the way back and die from that yellow V going back toward the stalk. Here's things that a lot of people don't think about though, and that is, go into your corn when your corn tassels. Get a little bit of pollen down your back. And see how many stalks of corn, when you walk through, see what's an average amount of leaves that show a nitrogen deficiency. Like in this case, this particular field, we had 3 leaves before we finally got to where the leaf stayed solid green. For every one of those leaves, even if it's completely dead and gone, count it. It may be 3, 4, 5 leaves. For every leaf count, you're 10 pounds short of nitrogen for every leaf you see that's showing that yellow leaf. Even if it's just started, count that as 10 pounds of N. When you walk through at tassel, you can just about get an idea, am I using enough nitrogen or not? Or if you know if it stays green all the way to the bottom, you don't see a nitrogen deficiency, then you can say, I've taken care of what I need. But what if you're walking through there at tassel? And the next question is, do you have any way to get nitrogen on? If you can put it through a pivot system, or if you can put it on with an airplane. Down where we are, even the guys that don't have pivots, that furrow irrigate, because we grow a lot of rice, they'll actually fly nitrogen on their corn after tassel. 100 pounds of ammonium nitrate used to be, well, 125 pounds of ammonium nitrate. We'd put on at tassel time, it'll make you another 30 bushels of corn if you got 3 leaves that are showing, because every leaf on that stalk below the ear leaf is growing the plant. From the ear leaf up, if you can stop that nitrogen deficiency before it gets to the ear leaf, you can still make that corn. And we'll have seed corn companies that do it. They'll put that, and if you can put it on with an irrigation system, you don't have to put it on all at once. You put it on like 10 or 11 pounds a week for 3 weeks in a row, or 3 waterings in a row, and you can do the same thing, because basically it takes on a soil that has the proper nutrient balance, it takes 1 pound of N to produce a bushel of corn. If you're showing 3 leaves right there, you put that 30 pounds of N on, it's going to make you 30 bushels more corn. And you put it on part of it and don't put it on the other part and just see if it doesn't happen. It's not too late at tassel time if you can get that nitrogen on. But you want a fast nitrogen, you want urea or ammonium nitrate, you don't want ammonium sulfate on. You can use ammonium thiosulfate through an irrigation system and it'll work as well. But you want something to get it on there quickly.
What about corn? Corn, you know what corn is? That's a foliar feed nitrogen?
Do you know what it, I'm not familiar with it.
It's like SRN, it's synthetic type nitrogen.
It's
synthetic type nitrogen.
What is it?
Liquid gallons.
It's a liquid from urea, from ammonium nitrate.
From urea.
I didn't mention that, but 32 and 28, we'll use that because the ammonium sulfate that we put on at planting time, that's not the total amount of nitrogen. We'll put on enough just to be sure we get that push at the end, and then come back with 32 or 28 to fill out what the last part of it is. And if it's someone that has the ability, like we've got seed corn companies that'll actually save their last 30 to 40 pounds of N and either put it through the irrigation system or fly it on with a plane after tassel, because they say, well, the more you can spread out the nitrogen, the better chance it is you're going to get the use of you're going to get a better use of that nitrogen. Is that a nitrogen deficiency? Well, can't look at it close enough, but to me that doesn't look like it's probably a nitrogen deficiency, but a lot of people think it is. That's potassium deficiency. Now you might have a beginning of a nitrogen deficiency here, but when you see that leaf start to die from the shank all the way out to the end from each side, and it moves in. A lot of people call me and say, we got a nitrogen deficiency. We didn't put on enough nitrogen. You go out there and it's potassium deficiency. If you have that start to run up the stalk and get 3 or 4 leaves showing this, putting nitrogen on there, unless it's a nitrogen deficiency, is not going to help there. Putting potassium on is the key, and we'll have clients that'll put enough potassium on, and next year, I can't put, I don't tell you can put potassium on that late and take care of it. But the next year you come in there and put the right amount of potassium on, it'll be green right down to the bottom of the stalk. Whereas with potassium deficiency, we may have 2 or 3 leaves that die, and if you have that many leaves that die, then that's going to have an effect on what kind of yield you can make. The other part of it is, take one of those stalks and cut it open, and if you start seeing that you've got all this accumulation and deterioration right there at each one of the nodes, that's a potassium deficiency. And that's one of the reasons why you start to, a lot of people say, oh, we've got problems here with stalk rot or something like that. A potassium deficiency will actually show up like that when you have that deficiency, and it'll give you a weak stalk, because potassium is the first key to stalk strength. Spring or fall application of potassium depends on where your pH is. If you're going corn and soybeans, if you have the pH above 6.5, put your potassium on as close to planting time as you can put it on, and don't let anybody tell you, oh, that plant won't get the use of it, because it will. Put it on as close to planting time as possible, because if you put potassium on in the fall of the year with a pH above 6.5, and you're going to grow corn this spring, you come back in and pull a sample where you, well, let's put it this way. We'll have clients who will say, I want to put my potassium on in the fall, and they got a pH of 6.6 or 6.7 or higher. We'll tell them, don't put it on in the fall, put it on in the spring, because they're going to grow corn and soybeans. One guy said, you can't tell me that I can't put potassium on, raise the potassium level on this field if I put it on in the fall. I said, it won't raise the level. He said, what if I put 1,000 pounds of 0060 on? I said, well, you can put it on, but it's not going to raise the level. He took a little triangular field, and he said, I'm going to put 1,000 pounds on here, and we'll pull a soil sample this fall and pull it next spring, and I'll show you we can raise potassium levels. I said, you're not doing it right. Take that little triangular field and split it in 2. Take soil samples on both sides, so you see what your potassium levels are on both sides. Then choose which side you want to put the potassium on. Put that 1,000 pounds on one side, don't put anything on the other side. Then come back in the spring and pull samples on both sides. He did that. We came back in the spring, pulled samples on the side where he put 1,000 pounds of potassium levels would come up. Pull sample on the side where he put no potassium levels would come up by the same amount. Because it's the residues breaking down that add that potassium. It's not that conventional potassium that you're putting on it. If your pH is below 6.5, it'll build it. You don't have to worry. You can put it on as long as you're below 6.5. That's talking a water pH, not a salt pH. That's what the private laboratories are going to do. But you put that potassium on and it'll build right up. But once you get above 6.5, there's too much calcium and magnesium, which has a double plus charge, that's coming around pushing that potassium out of the way. And potassium just doesn't have enough room to attach and stay on those clay and humus particles. If your pH is above 6.5, put your potassium on as close to planting time as possible. If you're growing wheat, just in case we don't say it at that time, we have clients growing wheat, we'll say, do you have enough potassium to get you through the winter? If they barely have enough potassium, we won't put any on. We'll wait and put the potassium on in the spring, simply because down where we are, you're going to raise a double crop beans or grain sorghum or peas behind. And if we don't put that on we don't put that potassium on in the spring, there's not going to be potassium for that next crop. Because if we put it on in the spring, just as the wheat starts to grow, it'll start pulling that potassium up. Then you come in and plant for the next crop and give that wheat stubble time to break down, you're going to get that potassium used all over again. So it's a matter of recycling the potassium. When we talk about phosphorus, when's the best time to put phosphorus on, fall or spring? And the answer there is it depends on what form you use. If you use diammonium phosphate or monoammonium phosphate or soft rock phosphate, if you're an organic grower, you can put it on in the fall if you want to. You can also put it on in the spring. But if you're using single super or triple super phosphate, put that on as close to planting time as possible. It's a starter phosphate. It's nothing else. It's a starter phosphate because if under adverse conditions in 4 weeks it's going to tie up and you're not going to be able to pick it up anymore. Under the very best conditions in 8 weeks it's going to tie up. You're not going to be able to pick it up anymore. We can't build phosphate levels using single super or triple super phosphate. We can build phosphate level with monoammonium phosphate or diammonium phosphate or with soft rock phosphate or with compost and manures. But we cannot build levels with 0060, I'm sorry, with 0460 or 020. So if you're putting on a plant feeder, which is 006, 0460 or 020, put it on as close to planting as possible. Use it like a starter fertilizer because that's what it is. And after that, it's going to tie up, it's going to revert back to tricalcium phosphate, and unless you can get hard rock phosphate to work, it's not going to work. Phosphate deficiency in corn, you can come in and put 250 pounds of monoammonium phosphate or diammonium phosphate on soil in the springtime, and it's extremely deficient in terms of phosphorus and still show a phosphate deficiency in that corn, unless you put a starter fertilizer there, a starter phosphate there with it. Because it's just not enough time for that phosphate to come in. After the first year it won't happen, but that first year you can actually still show a phosphate deficiency even though you put a huge amount on there and came in and broadcast it. So we tell all of our clients, if you have I haven't seen any phosphate levels like this up here, but in the area not far, 5 miles from where I live, there's a place called Delta, and it's the Mississippi-Ohio River Delta. Flat land for miles and miles. You do a phosphate test there, and they've never built the phosphate levels up, and we'll have, where we ought to have 250 to 300, they've got 25 to 30 phosphate. You can come in there and put on 250 pounds of MAP or DAP and still have a phosphate deficiency the first year, unless you put a starter phosphate with it. After that, if you plant in warm soils, after that you won't have the problem. But if you're going to plant corn in cool, damp soils, it's always a good idea to put a starter phosphate on, even if you have an excess phosphate in the soil. Always a good idea to put a starter on there because in cool, damp conditions, it's just hard for that corn plant to get enough to get started. One other thing, and that is, I thought I had that in there, but I guess I didn't put it in this one. If water stands over your soil, like in '93 when we had our 500-year flood, came in July, all the corn was made but not harvested, just lost it all. The farmers said, well, we didn't get any corn this year, now we're going to, spring '94, we need to put phosphate on? Well, you didn't harvest the crop last year, so soil test shows you got good phosphate, so don't put any phosphate on. Every farmer that didn't put a starter phosphate on, if water stood over that land, because a lot of the water stood over it for several weeks, where the water stood over, even though it was gone, it was dried out and so forth, they came in and planted that corn, and if you put just 30 pounds of starter phosphate on, was the difference between knee-high corn and belt-high corn. And the guys who came in there and put that starter on, one fellow had 2,000 acres of corn right behind the river. We went over and his hired man was a little careless of where he started and stopped. He'd turn it off before he got to the end and then get turned around and turn it on after he got up in the field. You could tell right where it turned on every time because it was knee-high till he turned it on, and it was belt-high once he got it started. And one time a hose stopped up for about 2.5 rounds. You can see right where it stopped up and where they found it because that row was short. Why did that happen? The phosphate tests on those soils show excellent phosphates. But they didn't get that phosphate. It's because of the biological reaction that you get from utilizing phosphate. Corn needs mycorrhiza fungi in that soil to pick up adequate amounts of phosphate, and when water stands over soil for 4 to 8 weeks, it kills out the mycorrhiza fungi, and it takes 8 weeks of warm weather for it to come back again. And if you don't have that 8 weeks, and there it got cold in the fall before the water was all off, springtime, wasn't enough time to get that mycorrhiza fungi back. If if you could do that, phosphate works fine, but otherwise that's starter. And that's one of the reasons why in a cool, damp soil, you put that on. The further north they are, the more we tell people be concerned about putting a starter on. If you wait till the soil warms up and whenever they say, well, the temperature's good for planting, you're not going to have a problem there. But when you start planting in cold, damp soil, use that phosphate. Starter, pop-up, or side dress, we call those plant feeders. Something that you put in to get the plant started, but it's not going to stay there for use for the next year. Biologically available phosphate, that's what we were talking about in terms of the, here's the slide I thought I had. We got clients that grow rice, and the worst challenge we ever had was, before I started to understand about mycorrhizal fungi, was a farmer who would say, well, we got to grow corn behind rice. So the water stands over that right up until harvest time. They dry it off, they harvest in the fall, there's not time for that mycorrhizal fungi to get established in that soil. You come back in the spring and the phosphate level may be 3 times higher in that soil than they show, but until you put a phosphate starter on there, you're going to have a phosphate deficiency. Whoops. Livestock waste. All I can say is, don't use a chart. Check what you got. Because all these don't even come close to a lot of manures that we see, whether it's dairy or beef or anything else. Everybody's got different numbers there. But when you start looking at livestock waste, there's one thing that we tell people to count on. If you're using cattle manure, it builds potassium faster. If you're using pig manure, it builds phosphate faster. It will do that, not saying that they won't build both. If you use chicken manure, it's about even though it doesn't look like it is there, it's about even for getting the potassium and phosphorus level built up with chicken manure. Same with sheep. Same with sheep manure. Now the difference in chicken manure, if it's broiler manure, it's about even, but if it's laying hen manure, the calcium in it can be a help or a hindrance, depending on if you need it's not, as I said, I think this morning, it's not unusual to find 300 pounds of calcium in a ton of laying hen manure. 300 pounds of calcium is equivalent to putting on half a ton of limestone to the acre. If you put on 2 tons, you put on the same equivalent as a ton of lime. As long as you need that, that's fine. When we talk about corn, one thing that I feel is far too neglected is the effect sulfur has on corn. In the 1990s, we've recommended sulfur for our corn growers for years, but in the 1990s, there was a study that was done that was published in all the ag research, all the ag publications, Farm Journal, Successful Farming, and all the others. It was a study done at the University of Missouri, and it said sulfur does not increase corn yields in the state of Missouri. They did research at the university, and they published the research. I thought I was going to get a lot of calls because we recommend a lot of sulfur for our clients, and sure enough, started getting phone calls. And the first guy called and asked me if I'd seen the article. Yes, I had. What question? He said, "Oh, I know what sulfur does for the corn. I just thought you might not see it because you're busy, so I called to let you know." And I got about 4 or 5 phone calls, and everybody said the same thing, because they didn't just take your word for it. They ran experiments, and each one of them tell you, "I remember when we did such and such to this field, and how much difference it made." Why didn't the university get a response on their sulfur? Well, when you looked into the study, control was nothing. 10 pounds of sulfur and 20 pounds of sulfur was the experiment, and the old rule of thumb was everybody said you put on 10 pounds of sulfur to grow corn. Not even close to what we'd have our clients put on. Turns out what we found was if we're trying to make 200 bushel corn, if we don't have it there and we don't put it there, because some soil will measure what we've got, but it takes 70 to 80 pounds of sulfur in the soil at tassel before you don't get a sulfur deficiency showing up in the ear leaf. It will be a limiting factor, if not the most limiting factor in terms of yield for that corn. 70 pounds of sulfur. Now, that's from all sources. Every kind of sulfate, whether we use ammonium sulfate, elemental sulfur, or the sulfur that's already there from that's being released from the humus or whatever. But when you start looking at sulfur, and you start considering how much sulfur does it take to grow a crop of corn versus how much phosphorus it takes, it's about even. Doesn't look like it is, Because of the way, like my fourth grade teacher used to say, class, you need to talk apples and apples or oranges and oranges. And when you start looking at sulfur, it's always expressed as needed as elemental sulfur. When you start looking at phosphorus, it's expressed as needing as P2O5. If you're going to express your phosphorus as P2O5, you need to express your sulfur as SO4. If you're going to express your sulfur as S, then you need to express your phosphorus as P. Well, you take a P2O5 and divide it by 2.3, that puts it down right to the same. You basically need just as much phosphorus to grow 100 bushel corn or 200 bushel corn as you do sulfur. And if you're growing vegetables, it takes even more sulfur than it does phosphorus. Most vegetables take more sulfur than it does phosphorus to grow. But most people put a lot of phosphate on, but they don't put that much sulfur on, especially east of the Mississippi River, especially east of the Missouri line. You start getting further west, they use a lot more sulfur because of high pH soils. But people in the east say, well, we don't have high pH, we don't need sulfur. You need sulfur as a nutrient, and since they've taken all the sulfur out of the air, I mean, we used to get a lot of sulfur from high sulfur coal. We don't get it anymore. Almost all the soils we look at, unless you're adding sulfur, are extremely deficient. Not just deficient, but extremely deficient in sulfur. Extremely deficient meaning if you got 6 parts per million, 4 parts per million, you need an absolute minimum for anything of 20 parts per million. But when we start looking at corn, to get 80 pounds per acre, that means you got to have 40 parts per million. No, that means in terms of 40 parts per million in the soil, that means you got 80 pounds of sulfur in altogether. So when we start looking at trying to grow 200 bushel corn, if we don't have 40 parts per million sulfur, we're going to add enough sulfur to get you there. And if we don't do that, sulfur is going to be a limiting factor, if not the limiting factor. So sulfur is easily leached. What sulfur you put on one year, most of the time that sulfur is going to be used or leached away within 12 months. Now, as you go ahead and get the soils in shape and get your calcium and don't have any excesses for that sulfur to take out, in the very beginning with sulfur, when you start putting it on, it'll go way up and come way back down. It's like mountains and valleys through there. Once you get that soil corrected, then it's more like this. And you can actually, once you get that soil corrected so you don't have any excesses, because the sulfur's job is to take out an excess. If you don't have any excesses anymore, now all of a sudden you can build that sulfur level up, and there'll be some time when we've got 2 or 3 years when we'll tell a farmer, look, you got enough sulfur. You don't have to put sulfur on, other than using some ammonium sulfate. In other words, you'll put his ammonium sulfate on to make sure you got the lead in for the corn, and that's as far as it has to go. You ever walk in a field and see that? That's a sulfur deficiency. You see it in almost every field of corn down where we live. Every field of corn, if a farmer's not using sulfur, you'll see that. When you look down in that world and you see those stripes, it's already hurt you. That's sulfur always shows up in the youngest leaves first. If you start seeing a yellow color in those youngest leaves and it's not deep dark green like the red, that's a sulfur deficiency. If you have a sulfur deficiency in corn, everybody says, oh, you got to use sulfate. Corn is a grass. If you're using pasture grass, if you're using wheat, if you're using corn, you can put 10 pounds of elemental sulfur on a corn crop, and it'll, if that's all you need, it'll green it up in 7 days. You can fly it on with an airplane. You can put it on when it's younger. You can put it on wheat in the same way. It'll show up in a week's time. You don't have to have sulfate sulfur. Grasses can take elemental sulfur. As long as it's a water-soluble sulfur, they can take elemental sulfur and utilize it, and you can see the color difference in a matter of a week. This is what's been advised over years and years. Nitrogen to sulfur ratio 15 to 1. That's why I've got this in red. That's not close to enough sulfur. If you're raising corn, it doesn't need to be 15 to 1. Better if you put it 10 to 1, but it's even better 6 to 1. What our clients that are raising high yield corn, we're putting 1 pound of sulfur for every 6 pounds of nitrogen. That's a magnesium deficiency in corn with the stripe. Now you can have a stripe like that and have other deficiencies. That might be iron, that might be zinc, but there's one thing. If that's a magnesium deficiency, you just turn it over. And it'll be purple on the underside of that leaf. If you see purple on the underside or red-violet color that's a magnesium deficiency. If you just see the stripes in it, you turn it over and it's not there, then that may be zinc, it may be iron. Yeah, it may be zinc, it may be iron. Magnesium deficiency in a plant can cut your yield by 25 bushels to the acre, because when you don't have enough magnesium, magnesium is the center of the chlorophyll and the nitrogen attaches around it. We actually have clients that will fly on magnesium at tassel, and still, where they put it on, they'll tell you we made 20 bushel or 25 bushels more corn. If you've got a magnesium deficiency, lots of sandy soils have magnesium deficiencies. We have one client at Home Farms, 8,000 acres. He started out the first year with 600 acres. He had black sand, and his black sands were his lowest yield, but he had all sand. Irrigated, he said the most I've ever made is 220 bushel corn. That year we came in, got him to put the nutrients on, and one of the things he had to put on was magnesium. He'd never put magnesium on those sands. He didn't need calcium, he needed magnesium. So he didn't need dolomitic lime, he needed magnesium. He put on, and he needed potassium, he put on 300 to 500 pounds of K-Mag to the acre. His yield went from 220, most he'd ever made, to 265, and he said, I got places hitting almost 300 on my combine. He said, we've never had yield monitored things like that. That wasn't one of those years when it was the best growing conditions. That was like 4 years ago. If you're short on magnesium and don't put it there, it makes a big difference in terms of yield. Effect of magnesium on corn yield, nitrogen requirements for a 200 bushel corn crop. If you got all the nutrients there and you want to raise a 200 bushel corn crop, we'll tell the client, okay, you need 1 unit of N per bushel of corn, so 200 units of N. As long as everything's there. But if you start looking at magnesium, if you've got less than 10% magnesium, instead of 1 unit of N, it'll take 1.5 units of N to try to get the same yield. On the other hand, once you get above 12%, 10 to 12 is ideal. That's where it takes 1 unit when everything else is there. Once you get above 12%, just get above 12%, then it takes 1 1/4 pounds of N to a bushel of corn. So we go from 200 units to 250 units just because we got more magnesium there. Once you get to above 15%, it takes 1.35 pounds of N per bushel of corn. Once you get above 20%, it takes 1.5, just like when you drop below 10%. Magnesium makes a difference because magnesium is antagonistic to nitrogen uptake in the crop. Boron sets the ear. If you don't have, we had some clients and say, one client was saying, one fellow, he was not a client then, he became a client, but he said, something wrong with seed corn anymore. I get a bunch of blank stalks out in my field. Well, he had put on so much fertilizer over the years, his potassium levels got up and he tied up his boron. If you get above 7.5% potassium, it starts tying boron up. Well, we had him put boron on and all of a sudden his blank stalks disappeared. Boron, first of all, if you are extremely low, and that's, we need a 0.8 parts per million boron on the test that we use. Some of those soils he had was 0.1, 0.2, so he didn't even have close. Once you get above 0.8, you got enough boron there, not just to set the ear, but to fill the grain in that ear. We need boron to be at least 0.8. If you're growing corn and you've got nice straight rows of corn, but you don't get that corn on the end to set, some people say, oh, it's because of hot weather. Other people say, oh, it's because of cold weather. Oh, it's because of genetics. You correct the boron C, it'll fill that corn right out to the tip. If you've got 28,000 ears of corn, let alone 32,000, and you put another 1/4 of an inch of corn on every ear, how much more corn did you just make? About 30 to 40 bushels to the acre. And this is one of the things that we see time and time again. A lot of people say, oh, I don't have enough phosphate. That's why it doesn't fill out to the end. If you've got good straight rows, that's not a phosphate problem. If those rows are all crooked and it's bent at the end, that may be a phosphate problem. But if you've got good straight rows, take a look at it. That corn ought to fill out everything that you can see a flat piece there and it doesn't fill out right. If it's flat, it pollinated enough, you ought to be able to fill that in. We've had clients that have been told, oh, you can't get that to come to the end because that's genetic. Well, one of our clients was a Pioneer dealer, and the Pioneer distributor came and he said, you can't get that to come to the end, it's genetic. Well, he got it all the way out to the end. He said, well, you just didn't plant a high enough population. He'd planted 32,000 population, but his cousin down the road that was a client made a mistake and he planted 38,000 population. Well, guess what? It filled all the way out to the end too. If you get the boron there, it's gonna fill that corn out. If you don't have 0.8 parts per million boron, and most soils don't, you're not gonna fill it out. You gotta have enough phosphate. If you don't have the phosphate there, the boron's not gonna work. But once you get just adequate phosphate, take a look and see. That boron will it'll do that for popcorn, it'll do it for sweet corn, and it'll do it for meal corn. This is a farmer right close to where we live. His copper was under 2 parts per million. Not because he hadn't put copper on that farm before, but because he had it lined. This is a sandy field that has an exchange capacity of about 4. He had limestone put on it, and when the lime spreader got to the end of the field, he still had limestone left. So he just started back over it till he used it up. Where he started back over, right to the line where he put that, he tied up the copper. The higher the calcium goes, for every ton of lime you put on, you tie up the equivalent of about 5 pounds of copper sulfate to the acre over the next 3 years. This didn't show up the first year, it showed up the 3rd year. And all his corn started falling over because he tied up his copper. Copper is the 3rd key to stalk strength. Potassium's 1st, manganese is 2nd, copper's 3rd. But excess nitrogen ties up copper, but this guy didn't use too much nitrogen, he used too much calcium. When you see that corn rolling like that, you tend to think, well, it hadn't rained in a while, right? Well, that corn was watered 3 days before. This is irrigated corn. It was watered 3 days before, and I went out there and took these pictures, and I kicked right there in the dirt. Look how much moisture is there. That's the same field. Look how it's rolled. It doesn't matter if he doesn't have moisture. He doesn't have zinc. If you have less than 6 parts per million zinc, you don't get the efficiency in terms of moisture absorption into the plant. And in this case, it isn't 6 parts per million. When you start seeing that, it's more like down at 2. So he had 1/3 the amount of zinc just to be at the minimum. All he'd have to do is come in there and put on 25 pounds of zinc sulfate, and he'd solve his water problem. At least this water problem, as long as he can irrigate. But same thing happens on turf grass, same thing happens on one crop after another. If you have less than 6 parts per million zinc, it's always taking more water to go to your corn crop than what you really have to have. Now that's on the test we use. Other soil tests will have different numbers and levels, and they'll tell you, well, your zinc level ought to be here. You'll have to evaluate. But on the test that we use, if you're below 6 parts per million, you're not getting the water efficiency. Anybody recognize that weed? Looks like somebody planted it. That was corn last year. This is in the springtime before they come in. This is like early spring before they come in and start to plant corn and so forth. Where they planted corn last year, this weed came up. I'd never seen it before. This is just a few miles from our house. I drive by our house to go to my daughter's, and every day I'd see this. And you know, they say curiosity killed the cat. Well, I'd see this and I thought, what happened there? So one day I just bought my soil probe and sacks to put some paper sacks to put leaf samples in, and I went out there, pulled samples out here in the middle, and that's that same weed, but it's real scrawny. It's not doing very well. But you get up here, boy, it looks great. So I pulled samples out here of the soil and pulled samples of the plant and sent them in. Pulled samples right up here in the row of the soil, pulled samples of the plant and sent them in. When it came back, severe zinc deficiency out here. Severe zinc excess right here. Zinc level was 3 times higher than it ought to be. But out here, it's deficient. They put all their zinc right in that row of corn. They put zinc sulfate and built the levels up. When you analyze that weed, guess what? That weed got all the nutrients it needs, except the zinc is sky high. But when you get out here where the zinc's deficient, the weed's deficient in zinc. It couldn't get enough zinc. That's the difference between what you're seeing right there. That weed could get enough, where it got the zinc, that's where it really took off in the grade. All I'm saying is, when you start putting nutrients down, broadcast your nutrients, because now out here there's nothing. Out here, and in here, there's too much. You can finally work it and get it spread out. Guess it's better than not doing anything. But if he had broadcast that in the first place, then his zinc would be better spread out and where it needs to be. When you start putting things down in a row, it's easy to exceed the law of the maximum. It's easy to start doing things that really, if you broadcast it and got it out there even, it'd be a lot easier because you're feeding the microbes in the middles as well as up close. Okay, that's all I'm going to say on corn, and we'll talk a little bit about wheat. This wheat field right here grows 200 bushel of wheat. Every year they plant it in wheat. It's 750 acres. And wherever they plant wheat, they can grow 200 bushel of wheat there. That's in Germany, close between the Belgian border and Cologne, Germany. One of the first places I ever saw that grew 200 bushel wheat. Their nutrient levels are terrific. When you look at those soils, they're great. But as we were walking through the field, this young fellow right here is the consultant. This guy's the owner. The other two, this is one of our clients. The other guy just happened to be visiting. And as we were on the way there, I told him, well, you know, if this guy will put some boron on, he could make another 5 bushels of wheat. And he looked at me and he said, he was a little bit incredulous. He said, I have you know that farmer raises 200 bushel wheat to the acre. Well, he was less than 0.8 parts per million boron. And I said, if he'll put 10 pounds of boron on, then he'll raise 205 bushels to the acre. And I said, here's how you tell. When we get there, because this grain's already filling. I've done that before, but this grain's already filling, and if you've got a boron deficiency in wheat, you can tell it easy. First of all, when the wheat starts filling the head, it'll fill the grains in the middle first, then it'll fill the grains at the top, and then it'll fill the grains at the bottom. And you go look at those bottom grains, and if you're below 0.8 parts per million boron, the bottom grains are going to be shriveled. If you've got above 0.8 parts per million boron, those grains on the bottom are going to be just as plump as the ones in the middle. That's where we put that extra 5 bushels of wheat in there. That's conservative. When you look at most wheat fields, I saw a little bit of this when I flew in yesterday. When you look at most wheat fields, you can tell, oh, there's a green strip and then there's some lighter areas. You just don't get a good nitrogen spread so many times. And basically where we get this heavy nitrogen spread here, and then out here it turns a little bit lighter. It takes 2.5 pounds of N to grow a bushel of wheat. That holds true anywhere I've been in the world, and a lot of people, oh no it doesn't. Well, that 2.5 pounds of N is including nitrogen from every source, whether it's from the humus, whether it's from legumes. But if a guy's growing 100 bushel wheat, or 50 bushel wheat, or 200 bushel wheat, it takes 2.5 pounds of N to grow a bushel of wheat. If you short your nitrogen, you're going to short your yield. Now, if you wonder about that, I just got an email from one of my clients in Canterbury, New Zealand. They grow some of the highest wheat yields in the world. He's a champion wheat grower. And I'm not talking about on a little spot. I'm talking about on his whole wheat, all the wheat he grows. He was harvesting his feed wheat, so it was feed wheat, not wheat for flour. But he said, Neal, the lowest yield on the yield monitor is 17 tons per hectare. That's 253 bushels to the acre. And he said the highest is 19 tons per hectare. That's 283 bushels to the acre. That's not on 10 acres. That's on 200 and some acre field. And guess what? It takes 2.5 pounds of N for every bushel of wheat. You're going to have to come up with it from somewhere. You're not going to make the yield. Well, I just put that in, you know, you can spread in a lot of ways, but if we can get a good even spread, a lot of times you can go up and look from the air and see who gets the best spread on their nitrogen. And if you're short in one part and put too much someplace else, you're not going to actually get the same kind of yield there. Wheat nitrogen deficiency on wheat, when you look at that spot right there, I tell all my clients, go and look at the lowest spot in your field. When you start to see a yellow come in there, 2 or 3 days later, you're going to be short wherever. That time to start going, thinking about putting on another application of nitrogen. And the more you can spread it out, the more efficient it is. Phosphate on wheat, most critical in the first 40 days. If you're short on phosphate, get it on at planting time. It makes more difference to get that phosphate on then than any other time. Sulfur deficiency symptoms, light green or yellow coloration in the youngest leaves. We'll have clients that'll just put on 10 pounds of elemental sulfur in order to get their sulfur level up above 20 parts per million. I had one client and they were putting on urea and they were putting 10 pounds of sulfur with it, and we were delivering recommendations for their planting their corn and their soybeans while they were putting the nitrogen in the spring on the wheat, and they're putting 10 pounds of sulfur. The guy stopped and said, they ran out of sulfur at the fertilizer company, so this last load doesn't have any sulfur in it. Went out there and spread it. A week later, the guy called me and said, come by, when you get here, come by and take a look. I want you to see this wheat field. We drove down there and he said, if I didn't know better, I would think I didn't put nitrogen on that last part of that field. He said, that's where they run out of sulfur. And he said, the nitrogen's there, but the sulfur isn't. Well, all you have to do is get out of the truck and walk out there, because when it's a nitrogen deficiency, the oldest leaves are going to be yellow. When it's a sulfur deficiency, the youngest leaves are going to be yellow. When the youngest leaves are yellow, that's a sulfur problem, not a nitrogen problem. If you're growing wheat and you don't put enough nitrogen on there to stay above 20 parts per million, it's going to hurt you in terms of root systems. I just had a client who switched from ammonium nitrate to ammonium sulfate as his nitrogen source in the fall because it lasts longer and it's a slower release and it gets cold and slows the wheat down. But he had 3,000 acres, and he said, we're going to put 300 acres in and run a test. They put the 300 acres in, and he said, we're going to do what you say on one side, and on the other side we'll do what we always did. One day he passed me on the road and blinked his light and pulled around behind me, and he said, come back here and look at this wheat. He said, every field, almost 300 acres, but we split. Look at this. Here's where we used ammonium sulfate, and here's where we used our program ammonium nitrate. And I said, well, Tommy, you're not quite being fair there, because we recommended trace elements on our side as well as the changing ammonium sulfate. And he said, well, really, we put the trace elements on all of it. He said the only difference is ammonium nitrate versus ammonium sulfate. Had 30% more root system. This is not this picture. I didn't ever know I'd be showing somebody that back then, but this is just a reminder to say, and he said, look at this, on every field we got 30% more roots. And the only difference was they used some sulfur there in that ammonium sulfate. Sulfur will increase rooting 30 to 50%. Well, that's a magnesium deficiency in wheat. Some people look at it and say it's either a nitrate deficiency or a magnesium deficiency. I don't know if you get it up here or not, but we get a purple tinge in about October. There'll be a purple color come over that wheat. That soil has too much magnesium and the wheat doesn't get enough. You come in there and analyze it, and anytime you have a soil that has above 12% magnesium, the higher it goes, the harder that wheat's going to have a problem getting the nitrogen, the magnesium it needs. And if it goes below 10%, same thing. And now it can't utilize the nitrogen properly. In our area, the old advice was, well, it's either a nitrate deficiency or a magnesium deficiency. Put on some more dolomite lime and put on some more nitrogen. You put on more dolomite lime, you just made the problem worse, because you just raised the magnesium level again. Chelated magnesium, that's what we tell our clients. Use chelated or use magnesium sulfate. Come in and they say, well, if it's already high in magnesium, aren't we going to make it worse? Well, a gallon per acre of 5% magnesium only adds a half pound of magnesium per acre. We're not putting on much, but it makes a big difference in terms of being able to utilize. If you put magnesium on a soil that's deficient in magnesium, you come in there and put a foliar application, it'll green it up in a matter of 3 days, because it enables that soil to use the nitrogen. We talked about boron and grain fill. Nitrogen ties up copper. You put on way high amounts of nitrogen to try to get the wheat yields up and don't have enough copper there, that's what you're going to get. It'll cause lodging of the wheat. Manganese can do that too. Copper deficient wheat, the reason I put this in here is because most of the soils in the world are deficient in copper. That's called buggy whip. Don't know if you see that here or not, but if you're copper deficient, you'd see it. This is from the American Phytopathological Society. Take-all disease in wheat. Every one of those little spots right there had take-all disease. Only difference is they're copper deficient. the others have adequate copper. If you're less than 2 parts per million copper, the lower it goes below 2 parts per million, the more chance you're going to have take all disease in your wheat. I have had calls from Minnesota and from Ontario, Canada, and out into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and they say, Neal, does copper get rid of take-all disease in wheat? The first time I had phone calls years ago, I didn't even know what take-all disease was. We didn't have it down in our area. I said, I never heard of it. I don't know. And finally, one of the guys actually sent me a study that was done by University of Alberta, and they say the same thing. Get your copper levels up. That's the problem with take-all disease in wheat, not enough copper. How much does it take on wheat? 2 parts per million. You can solve that in 1 year, basically, if you're willing to put enough money into copper. But 2 parts per million will take care of it. Copper is necessary to fight any kind of rust and fungus diseases in any crop. But one of the easiest things to eliminate is put your copper on wheat, and right to the line where you get it above 2 parts per million, guys will call and say, we got rust to the line. And where we put that copper, it's not there. I've had a number of guys call and say that. Down wheat from excess nitrogen or excess K or deficient K and or deficient manganese and or deficient copper. Any one of those can be a problem to have down wheat. Too much nitrogen, too much potassium blocking out the manganese, too little potassium because that's key to stalk strength, too little manganese or too little copper. Potassium, manganese, and copper, any one of those missing, got a weak stalk. Soybeans need 5 pounds of N per bushel. 70% of that comes from nodulation. But it takes 5 pounds of nitrogen to raise a bushel of soybeans. If you're going to raise 100 bushel beans, it takes 500 pounds of nitrogen. Now, 70% of that comes from nodulation in the air in a good year, but still, 100 bushel beans, 5 times 100, 500, 5 times 7, that's 350, so we need 150 pounds of nitrogen from somewhere. Raise that much in terms of beans? Well, if you got 5% humus, you got 100 pounds of it right there. Most people don't have that. If you got 2% humus, you got maybe 40 pounds. You got to come up with another 110 pounds from somewhere. What we find more often than not, the guys that are looking for high yield soybean, you get your soil in good shape, but nitrogen turns out to be the factor that's still limiting. And most people think you can't put nitrogen on beans, oh, that'll make the rhizobium lazy. Kip Cullers from Southwest Missouri at a meeting one time, somebody asked him, well, all that nitrogen you put on, doesn't that stop your nodulation? He said, I've never been able to put on enough nitrogen to make the nodules lazy in a soybean. He said, I've never been able to put enough nitrogen on. As long as you've got the soil in shape, the nodulation is still there. He said, we don't get lack of nodulation when we put on nitrogen to raise 120 bushel soybeans. That's just one of those things people tell you, and that's the same thing our clients will tell you. When you put nitrogen on, it does not make those rhizobium bacteria lazy. You put the nitrogen on there if you need it. Once you've got the other things there in order to make the yield, that's what you got to do next.
What time would you put that up?
What time?
When would you put that up?
If it's ammonium sulfate, we haven't put it on right at planting time. Time to quit? Yeah. All right. Well, I'll just say this and then we'll quit, because this may be something that will help you up here without running a molybdenum test, because molybdenum tests are pretty expensive. If you're raising soybeans, you've got a planter where you can go in and inoculate 1 or 2 boxes in the planter, buy you some molybdenum inoculant. Just inoculate one. The lower the pH, the truer this is. Buy some molybdenum inoculant and inoculate 1 or 2 of those boxes of seed. Plant the seed, and the day that seed comes up, you want to be there. You want to be there the first day it comes up. And start looking, because if you're molybdenum deficient, where you put that molybdenum inoculant in the planter, you'll get a solid stand of beans from one end of the field to the other. And on the rest of them, if you're molybdenum deficient, it'll take 2 or 3 days before you get that solid stand. That's how to find out if molybdenum is going to make a difference for you or not. You can run that test and find out is molybdenum a problem rather than the other way around. So I'll just say that may save you a molybdenum test, but it's easy enough to see and it's easy enough to do. But you're going to tell it by how that seed germinates and comes up, because it'll come up all. If molybdenum's a problem, it'll come up all at once where you put it, and it'll take 2 to 3 days to get a stand where you don't. Okay. All right, so
First, let's give this Neal Neal said he would take some questions, but before he does that, I have a couple housekeeping items, so those of you who are ready to go can go ahead and go. The white survey forms that are in your folder, we'd really appreciate your feedback. If you haven't been doing that throughout the day, if you could take some time to do that now. There's a basket on the tray in the back. You can put your surveys in there. Those of you who are interested in your RUP credits, those forms are back in the back with some pencils. You can put those in the basket too. I'll be putting a slide up here while Neal answers questions that has the code for the afternoon sessions that you can write on your sheet. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and I'll open it back up to Neal for any questions you might have.
okay, let me just say it this way, and that is, if you're afraid you might not have time to do it otherwise, well, you can ask a question for everybody to hear, or if you're too bashful to do that, I'm going to be around a while, so you can come up and ask me afterward. Either way you'd like to do that, I'm not tired of talking. So.
Copper timing on wheat.
Copper timing on wheat, put on every micronutrient as far as the metals, iron, manganese, copper, and zinc, put that on as soon as you can. If you can put that on in the autumn before you're going to plant in the spring, as far as corn and soybean, put it on, the sooner you get them on there, it's going to be about 3 years before you see the full response from it. But even the fellows that put copper in with their last nitrogen application just before the wheat started to grow in the spring, still, that guy said, right to the line where we got that copper on, no rust.
Difference between organic matter and humus.
Difference between organic matter and humus. Organic matter is anything that's been alive, basically. But humus is when you take that organic matter and break it down to the point where it can't be broken down anymore. So you break it down into its smallest component, which is called an organic colloid. Then when you get that stuff to where it can't be broken down anymore, that's real true humus.
Can you measure humus?
Yes, you can.
You can.
Yes, we actually, that's all we measure on our test. It's colloidal humus.
'Cause
We
you
don't
always
measure
see
total organic matter.
You see organic matter as a percent, not humus.
A lot of people call organic matter that because they put a certain amount of undecomposed material in there, but when we measure the humus, it may say organic matter, what humus is organic matter, but it's the real true colloidal humus in that soil.
So there is a difference.
Yes, there is. Yes.
What's the best way to get boron?
What's the best way to get boron? Well, in actual fact, as long as you come in there and what I'd tell you, the best thing to do is make sure you get a good broadcast application of it, and whether you use a liquid boron or a dry boron, anything it takes, just put your boron on before you got something there you don't want killed. Because once that plant gets up, we have organic growers that use boron to kill their weeds when they're about that tall. It works just like a herbicide. If you put on 2 pounds of actual boron at a time, it'll kill those weeds and it'll kill whatever else is growing there too. So put it on before you plant. Otherwise you won't have a problem.
Question to go along with that one, is it safe to put boron in your starter?
Is it safe to put boron in your starter? Well, if you got a liquid boron, it may be a little safer. I'd tell you it's a whole lot better to broadcast it than it is, because if you make any kind of mistake at all, as I say, I've had more farmers kill crops with boron than anything else we've done, and I mean kill them dead. But every time it's been because they didn't follow the instruction, they did something wrong.
I got another question. Is it safe to put 28 in the pivot across soybeans?
Well, what I would say there, I don't know how much 28 you can put in a pivot across soybeans before you could have an adverse effect. As long as you can do it and doesn't burn those beans, then fine. But the thing about it is, to me, you want to get that nitrogen on early enough to make a difference. Right. And what happens is with ammonium sulfate, when you put that on at planting time, it's going to be 60 days later before you get that push. Now, if you use 28, you need that on at least 30 days before you want that push. So, as long as you can do it in a timely manner and not hurt the beans, then that should work fine. The other part of that is, if you get a big washing rain, it may wash it out before it has a chance for the beans to get it. That's all. That's all. Yes, sir.
You don't seem to like anhydrous. I know there's not many of us here that still use anhydrous, but I have a couple big tanks, and I use anhydrous on beans too. I've tried it on 100 acres of beans, and I've had a tremendous result. Why? You seem
Well,
to
it isn't, it is, I don't want to tell you I don't like anhydrous, it's just a matter that with anhydrous, what happens is, with anhydrous, if we put that anhydrous on, and I don't know how you do it, but we knife it in at home, and you get, most of that nitrogen spreads about 3 inches on either side of the knife. When you do a nitrate and ammonia analysis, 96% of that nitrogen is within a 7-inch band there. Well, in doing that, the roots have to come out and pick it up. Whereas if you broadcast, well, the roots don't have to go as far, so that's why we tell our clients, look, use 20% more nitrogen, because if we don't use 20% more nitrogen, we don't get the same corn yield.
I'm RTK strips, so it's right there underneath the row.
As far as long as you're getting the use out of it, we don't tell clients to change, whatever they say, look, this is what we're gonna use, this is where we go from. So it isn't a matter of saying, oh, I don't like anhydrous ammonia. I used to not like it when I was putting it down and didn't have a cab on the tractor, but otherwise it wasn't too bad.
That'd be cheap.
Well, Molly doesn't actually, and that's not an inoculant for the rhizobia. Well, there used to be something, and may still be around, called Molly Knox.